Hi everyone. Today I wanted to talk about the recent developments which have come out in the last 24 hours regarding the caravan full of explosives that were found in the outer suburbs of Sydney in January earlier this year. As predicted by many people on Twitter and Telegram, including myself, the whole thing was fake. Now, I want to talk about the underlying agenda behind this, who benefits from it, where we go from here, and the implications of anti-Semitism being used as a political weapon against the Australian public. But for clarification, I really need to re-emphasise the fact that this whole so-called terrorism event was a complete fraud, and the whole thing was staged. And don't take my word for it, the Australian Federal Police have said as much publicly, as reported by in the BBC, the ABC, The Guardian, Channel 9, and plenty of other news websites as well. Like The Noticer, for an example, who I very happily write for from time to time as a contributor, and it's worth pointing out that The Noticer has been calling out this hoax for months now, long before the Australian Federal Police finished their investigation just recently. It's also worth pointing out that the entire investigation was top secret, and no meaningful information was allowed to be released to the public prior to the investigation being concluded. Which is very strange if you ask me, but that's why this topic is back in the news today. It's too bad so sad for Australians though, who had to have draconian legislation put in place designed to attack our God-given right to free speech or to have a political opinion about anything. And if you can hear my neighbour's dog barking, I'm sorry for that, we're just going to have to roll with the punches. Now, you can refer to those legacy news media articles, if you like, for clarification, like the BBC, Channel 9, The Guardian, etc. If you like your news watered down, which has been edited by those who seek to persecute you and silence you, but I just want to read a few lines from The Noticer who reported on these developments, for context, for the sake of this video. Then I want to show you some things that I found very interesting and quite concerning. And if you are skeptical about The Noticer, everything in all of their articles is linked and refers to primary citations or other news reports on the topic. So this particular article came out late last night. Quote, "An explosive-laden caravan found in Sydney was a fake anti-Semitic terror plot concocted by criminals and never an actual threat, police have confirmed. The discovery of a caravan in Dural, which also contained Jewish addresses and a note saying, 'Fuck the Jews,' but no detonator, was described by Premier Chris Minns as terrorism and a potentially mass casualty event, as soon as the investigation was made public in late January. Weeks later, Mr. Minns brought in controversial new hate speech laws, calling them a strong response to anti-Semitism, while the federal government also cited a spate of alleged anti-Semitic attacks for pushing through its own hate crimes bill, which passed with bipartisan support. Imagine that, reading on. But on Monday, the Australian Federal Police revealed that, almost immediately, experienced investigators within the Joint Counter-Terrorism Team believed that the caravan was part of a fabricated terrorism plot, essentially a criminal con job. Now, I want to show you what the Australian Federal Police Deputy Commissioner of National Security, Chrissy Barrett, was allowed to reveal to the public after their top secret investigation. But let's again refer to New South Wales Premier Chris Minns, who, by the way, is a giant advocate for Zionism, the State of Israel, the genocide in Gaza, and the eradication of free speech in Australia. This is what he said before the investigation.
Clearly, police are very concerned and the community is very concerned about the rising number of anti-Semitic attacks in our community escalating to the point where there was a mass casualty event.
Mass casualty event, apparently. And clearly the police are very concerned. That's what he said.
I want to make it very clear, police take this threat incredibly seriously. As I've said for many, many weeks now, the full resources of the state of New South Wales and New South Wales Police have been deployed to confront this very serious threat to our community.
Now let's refer to Chrissy Barrett.
Almost immediately, experienced investigators within the Joint Counter-Terrorism Team believed that the caravan was part of a fabricated terrorist plot.
Almost immediately.
Essentially a criminal con job. This was because of the information they already had, how easily the caravan was found, and how visible the explosives were in the caravan. Also, there was no detonator. Today, I can reveal that the caravan was never going to cause a mass casualty event, but instead was concocted by criminals who wanted to cause fear for personal benefit.
What personal benefit would criminals have? I mean, obviously there's a certain group of people that benefit from the amplification of anti-Semitism and all of that sort of stuff. The legislation changes. We'll get back on that soon. It's also interesting now that we know the whole thing was a hoax, where someone somewhere was putting money into the pockets of criminals to carry out these fake attacks on Jewish people, as was reported by ASIO chief Mike Burgess earlier this year. We now have the Liberal Party and the Labour Party tripping over each other like the Three Stooges, pointing fingers at each other for the way that they each reacted during the so-called Summer of Hate. But in reality, both of them are to blame. Labour introduced the bill, and the Liberals forced them to make it tougher and sought to remove protections for political speech. Of course, this was completely amplified by the media as well. It felt like not a single day went by where every instance of graffiti being sprayed somewhere in the country triggered an entire day of solemn reflection, accompanied by a steady stream of interviews from politicians and representatives of Jewish lobby groups painting a picture of a nation where apparently Jews are in constant danger. I don't know about you, but this apathy-inducing episode during the so-called Summer of Hate, it was just intolerable. I was just sick of hearing about it. And to be fair, there were politicians who were calling out the bullshit, like Senator Babbitt, who maintained a free speech position. Also, Libertarian MP John Ruddick criticised the rapid legislation response, suggesting that the public was manipulated to accept restrictions on free speech. Former Liberal MP Craig Kelly echoed this sentiment, questioning the necessity of hate speech laws enacted under false pretenses. Before Australia knew that it was a fabricated terrorism plot, before the public realised this was all about stripping away their rights, many people, including myself, were calling it out and warning the public about it. In fact, back in January the 13th, I wrote an article warning about the weaponisation of anti-Semitism in Australia and how it is used as a political tool to indoctrinate people, silence people, stifle criticism of Israel, influence Australian foreign policy, or further specific legislative changes. And this wasn't just my opinion alone. Even Jewish people were saying as much. The article brought up research from the Jewish Council of Australia, which shed a light on how the vast majority of anti-Semitic incidences in Australia in the year 2024 were fake, exaggerated, overstated, or misrepresentations. Now, the main takeaway point here is how this is affecting Australian people. I want these legislation changes to be repealed and revoked, but it's unlikely that is going to happen. Another person who has been calling this out since day one, who I want to give a shout out to, is an Australian-based libertarian who is very active on Twitter, going by the name Mikamius. I believe that's how you pronounce it. Apparently, the Australian Jewish Association has been giving him a hard time. He recently had a bit of a back-and-forth argument with the Australian Jewish Association, who he alleges that one of their associates tried to dox and harass him and intimidate him. He also goes on to talk about how a lot of these organisations are obsessed with Jewish values and pushing that onto the Australian public, where he is more interested in what Australians want. Now, something he said recently in this post was, quote, "The only reason the hate crime, hate speech amendments passed without issue is because of the details below." Back in June 16th, 2021, the High Court of Australia illustrated major concerns with freedom of speech and acknowledged that it's only implied and that it is a human right, but it's also stipulated. Quote, "For my part, with greatest respect, it is arguable that the human rights protection does not exist." Unquote. He goes on to say that Australia needs a Bill of Rights enshrined into its constitution. Not separate, it must be within. If it's within, it can't be breached, and even if breached, the High Court has a binding constitutional document to use to back up its judgment as right now it has nothing. Australia is in peril and we need to get this rectified. And he posts some interesting screenshots of a report that details exactly that, as you can see here. Politicians are often tempted to exploit crises, real or manufactured, to advance their agendas, through exaggerating or fabricating problems. They generate fear or outrage, conditioning the public to accept preordained solutions. This problem-reaction-solution dynamic is a potent political tool. A crisis is exploited or created, the public reacts emotionally, and a solution is presented by the politicians or the media as the only viable option. We're seeing this now with anti-Semitism, and we saw it earlier with COVID-19.
It's time to get tough. We need a COVID-like response to anti-Semitism. Reports.
In this process, freedom can be sacrificed under the guise of safety, ending hate, or promoting progress. Social cohesion. The tragedy of such manipulation rests not only in its deceit, but also in its corrosive effect on freedom. Lies, once mandated, necessitate the suppression of dissent. To maintain the illusion of truth, critical voices must be silent. Alternative narratives discredited, and public discourse controlled. That is why we're being silenced. That is why we're being censored. And that is why they create new legislation changes every single day. Now, this isn't something that is exclusive to Australia either. Scholars and activists have noted that charges of anti-Semitism are sometimes used to suppress legitimate criticism of Israel's policies. Norman Finkelstein, in his book Beyond Chutzpah, argues that organisations like the ADL have, since the 1970s, exploited historical Jewish suffering to shield Israel from critique. Now, there does exist criticism of Jewish people and the state of Israel in Australia, but it's not without reason, let's be real. I could post a 50-minute collage of news articles here where anti-Semitic events were proven to be hoaxes, but for the sake of time I will spare you. But what I do want to say is, and I need to be careful here, none of this is about anti-Semitism. None of this is about Nazism. It has nothing to do with racial prejudice or ignorance. It has nothing to do with a lack of Holocaust education. It has nothing to do with hatred of Jewish people. Let me give you an example. There is almost as many Scandinavian people in Australia. There are almost as many Japanese people in Australia as there are Jews in Australia. The numbers are not too much different. Now, why is there no rampant levels of criticism on Scandinavian people in Australia? Why is there no extreme level of criticism of Scandinavian foreign policy, or how they treat their geographic neighbours? I mean, sure, Scandinavians aren't bombing people, but the point remains. How many Scandinavian lobby groups are there in Australia? How many of them are backed by a billion-dollar lobby group or corporations which salivate at the opportunity to eliminate free speech, change laws, influence politics, or change the school curriculum? Now, ask all of those questions about the Japanese people living in Australia. It's the same answer. In large, certain groups are more compatible with our country. It's just the way it is. And some of the time, people come to Australia escaping persecution, poverty, war, or whatever it is. And sometimes when they get here, they try to bring that stuff with them. And Australians are not the problem. We're on the brink of the total collapse of our freedoms here in Australia. It needs to be addressed, it needs to be changed, and someone needs to say something about it. And on that note, thanks for watching. If you enjoyed the video, give it a thumbs up, share it around on social media, all of that really helps. Check the description below for sources, link below to our Telegram group, all of that sort of stuff. Until next time, peace.